the civil rights movement created a lot of progress. And yet this stubborn, what they perceive as inequality, right? The statistics of success, which show that, as an aggregate population, Black people don't have the same kind of wealth as
Yeah.
other racial groups, right? These are some of the objective markers that they're pointing to, which they claim are being caused by systemic racism. I disagree with that narrative. But part of the way we can be sympathetic to it and understand it from a cultural dimension, as Orlando Patterson attempts to do, is to recognize that we talk about these worldviews, right? Traditional, modern, and progressive. There's a worldview, a stubbornly persistent remnant of a cultural worldview that exists in the timeline of history before traditionalism. We might call it pre-traditional, right? Orlando Patterson calls it the street configuration, right? And it's certainly, they've been very careful to say in inner city neighborhoods, in distressed neighborhoods, the majority of the people who live there are not embedded in this street configuration, this pre-traditional worldview. But the fact that it persists there, as seen in gang culture and prison culture and sort of the gangster mentality that is behind much of the shootings and the turmoil that exists in these places, that does radiate out. It is partially responsible for the persistence of the inequality and the large percentages of Black people who were in prison. This worldview, we might call it pre-traditional. I think there's a dignity there. I mean, I think certainly it's antisocial. We can't just sort of, it's not compatible with a law-abiding civilization. So we have to be able to be biased against this form of culture, but it's not specific just to Black people. This pre-traditional warrior culture, I think if we want to talk about it with a certain amount of dignity, we can say, we call it warrior consciousness and culture. It's developmental psychology recognizes it as egocentric consciousness or pre-conventional consciousness. And you can see it in white people in the skinheads, right? You can see it in Hispanic people in MS-13, right? You can see that even Asian people have, the Hmong street gangs, right? So this form of culture, this warrior culture, is stubborn. It persists across generations, and overcoming it, helping those who are trapped within it to evolve out of it, I would say is a key element of achieving the otherwise laudable goals of the anti-racism movement, and that is greater equality. But as you've said, and I want to just underline how much I agree, that ultimately, racializing this problem sets it back. In other words, it may create more racism in the long run, or at least there's some danger there. So I think calling it systemic racism and blaming it on the persistent racism in our society, while there's certainly some, I would say the systemic element is better understood from a cultural lens that recognizes how this worldview has a kind of a membrane. People are trapped in it, and how we can gently persuade people to evolve out of it. Again, that's one of the contributors to the Cultural Matrix book, Tommy Shelby. In his contribution, he tries to steelman the argument for development. That as Black families have been devastated, and that we need to create this sort of culture of responsibility, all of which I agree with. He basically says what he calls soul building, that the government can't do that. That our Constitution would prevent, and that's paternalistic. And after steel manning the argument, he then rejects it. But I reject his rejection, and I think that we do have an obligation to do some soul making. And I think that part of it involves changing the physical life conditions, like you said. Like if you take $10 billion and put $100 million into each one of these distressed inner cities, that would go a long way. But just external reform isn't adequate. It's necessary, but not sufficient. We also need internal reform. And how do we go about that? I mean, maybe the government can't do it, but certainly NGOs. I mean, there's, like you mentioned, the nurses that go to unwed mothers and serve as role models, right? They talk about that in the Cultural Matrix. So that's an example of an institutional attempt at soul making, soul building. And I think we can also see other examples of the success of what you might call the evolution of consciousness, interventions, fostering cultural evolution In a European example, in the late 19th century, there was a movement within, especially Scandinavia, for what they called transformative civic education. There were these retreats that they sent young people to. It's called Bildung, and this idea of Bildung was to sort of help people awaken to modernist consciousness, right? To sort of take responsibility and have a go at creating something new and being part of progress. So that's just one small example. I think we probably agree on numerous examples of successful soul building, and I think that's what needs to happen in many of these inner cities, and that would go a long way to reducing inequality, crime, the prison population. We can almost say that almost every human problem is at least partially a problem of consciousness, because the solution to that problem involves raising consciousness, evolving consciousness, and consciousness evolves in lots of ways. But one of the most significant ways it evolves is through identification with these structures of history, these cultural agreement structures. And so what it means to evolve your consciousness, at least partially, is to evolve from pre-traditional to traditional, from traditional to modern. And because progressivism is sort of dissolves traditional culture, it competes with traditional culture in a way that invalidates many of the needed elements of traditional culture. Traditional culture has the moral resources to deal with the warrior worldview. Progressivism is defenseless against it. It gets gamed and grifted by those who are at this warrior egocentric level. And so understanding that we need the resources of traditionalism, we need strong families, and that progressivism's attack on the very family structure is a pathology of progressivism that we need to remedy to strengthen traditionalism so we can play its necessary role in this larger cultural ecosystem of helping people move beyond the stuckness of this warrior culture, which plagues our society still.
Okay, Steve. We've got politics, we've got psychology, we've got spirituality, we've got transcendence, we've got gratitude, and we've got hope. I like the sound of it. So thanks for sharing. And this is the first of many conversations I expect to be having with the community centered around the Institute for Cultural Evolution. Making no commitments, but expressing my interest in learning more and going deeper. So let's stay in touch.
See you as a strong ally and an inspirational, leader in your own right for this movement. I mean, from a cultural standpoint, we want to make common cause with you and Barry Weiss and some of the other people who are attracted to the Austin University, for example. A lot of it is animated by this sort of reaction to progressivism and the pathologies of progressivism, and we think that's appropriate and healthy. But we want to help this movement by helping them transcend and include the best of progressivism and effectively move from this, cultural antithesis to a cultural synthesis, and your leadership's an important part of that.
Thanks very much, Steve McIntosh, President, Institute for Cultural Evolution, Boulder, Colorado, my guest here at The Glenn Show. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Glenn.